The whispers started the moment Delilah Morrison stepped out of her father's wagon that Sunday morning in August of 1876. Her full figure draped in a modest blue calico dress that somehow seemed to emphasize rather than hide the curves that made the church ladies purse their lips in disapproval. She had known this day would come eventually, the day when the protective shield of her father's respectability as the town blacksmith could no longer guard her from the sharp tongues and sharper stares of Cedar Falls, Colorado. At 23 years old, unmarried and decidedly not built like the willowy girls who giggled behind their hands at social gatherings, Delilah had become something of an oddity in this small mountain town, where conformity was valued above almost everything else. Her father, Benjamin Morrison, had passed away 3 weeks prior from a sudden fever, and now she stood alone at the base of the church steps, clutching a basket of fried chicken and biscuits she had prepared for the monthly church picnic. "Poor thing," she heard Mrs. Henderson say to Mrs. Pritchard, their voices carrying across the churchyard despite their attempts at discretion. "Without her father to watch over her, who knows what will become of her? A woman of her size and age, unmarried, it is quite unseemly." Delilah felt the familiar burn of shame creeping up her neck, but she squared her shoulders and walked toward the gathering area where families were spreading blankets beneath the cottonwood trees. She had every right to be here. She had been baptized in this church, had attended services every Sunday since she was old enough to sit still through a sermon. Her father had been a respected member of this community for 20 years, but respect, she was learning, did not necessarily transfer from father to daughter. She approached a group of women arranging food on the long wooden tables that had been set up for the potluck meal. "Good morning," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I brought some chicken and biscuits." The women turned as one, their expressions ranging from polite disinterest to outright disdain. Mrs. Pritchard, the minister's wife, gave her a tight smile. "How thoughtful! You can place it over there at the end." The dismissal was clear. Delilah set her basket down where indicated, noticing how the women subtly shifted away from her as if her presence might somehow contaminate them. She had worn her best dress, had pinned her thick auburn hair into a neat bun at the nape of her neck, had scrubbed her hands until they were raw. But none of it mattered. To them, she would always be too much, too round, too tall, too unmarried, too alone. She walked back toward the wagons, intending to retrieve the quilt her mother had made years ago before consumption had taken her when Delilah was just 15. But when she reached the spot where her father's wagon stood, she realized with a sinking heart that she had forgotten to pack it in her distraction that morning. The ground was still damp from the previous night's rain, and sitting directly on the grass would ruin her dress. "Excuse me, miss." The voice was deep, rough as gravel, and came from somewhere above and behind her. Delilah spun around and found herself staring at the broad chest of a man who had to be at least 6 feet 4 inches tall. She tilted her head back to meet his eyes, and her breath caught in her throat. He was unlike any man she had ever seen in Cedar Falls. His hair was dark brown, nearly black, and fell past his shoulders in waves that suggested he cut it himself with a hunting knife when it got too long. His face was all hard angles and sharp planes, weathered from years of sun and wind, with a thick beard that did nothing to hide the strong jaw beneath. But it was his eyes that held her captive, a startling shade of green that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed walls of propriety and pride. "Yes," she managed to say, hating how breathless she sounded. He held out a folded blanket, gray wool that looked soft and well-maintained despite its obvious age. "Noticed you forgot yours. You are welcome to share mine if you like." Delilah blinked at him, confusion warring with gratitude. She had never seen him before, which was remarkable given how small Cedar Falls was. Everyone knew everyone, or at least knew of them. "I do not believe we have met." "Name is Jacob Brennan," he said, his voice carrying a hint of an accent she could not quite place. "Irish, perhaps, or Scottish. I live up in the mountains, about 10 miles north of here. Do not come into town much, but Reverend Pritchard asked me to deliver some pelts to his brother in Denver, so I figured I would stop by for the service on my way through." A mountain man. That explained everything: the weathered appearance, the self-sufficient air about him, the muscles that strained against his homespun shirt. Men like him lived alone in the wilderness, trapping and hunting, venturing into civilization only when necessity demanded it. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Brennan, but I could not possibly already spread it out over there," he interrupted, gesturing toward a spot beneath a massive cottonwood, far from where the other families had clustered together. "Plenty of room for two. Unless you would rather sit on wet ground and ruin that pretty dress." There was no mockery in his tone, no sly insinuation. He stated it as simple fact, the way one might comment on the weather or the time of day. Delilah glanced toward the other picnickers and saw several women watching them with barely concealed curiosity and disapproval. She could already imagine the gossip that would spread. Delilah Morrison, sitting alone with a strange mountain man, bold as brass. But then again, they were already gossiping about her. At least this way she would not have to spend the afternoon standing awkwardly alone, pretending not to notice how no one invited her to sit with them. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That is very generous. I am Delilah Morrison." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Morrison." He touched 2 fingers to his forehead in a gesture that might have been a salute or simply his version of tipping a hat he was not wearing. "Come on then. Food is about to be served, and I have not had a proper meal in near about a week." She followed him to the blanket, acutely aware of every eye tracking their movement across the churchyard. Jacob Brennan moved with the casual confidence of a predator, his long strides eating up the ground with easy efficiency. When they reached the blanket, he waited until she had settled herself, arranging her skirts carefully around her legs, before he lowered himself to sit beside her. Up close, she could see the small details that spoke to his life in the wilderness: the calluses on his hands, thick and rough from hard work, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the way his shoulders seemed perpetually tensed, as if ready to spring into action at the first sign of danger. He smelled of pine and wood smoke and something else, something clean and masculine that made her heart beat faster. "You are new to Cedar Falls?" she asked, searching for something to say to fill the awkward silence. "Not new exactly. Been living in these mountains for about 5 years now. Just do not make it down to town much." He stretched his long legs out in front of him, crossing them at the ankles. "Too many people, too much noise. Prefer the quiet of the woods. I imagine it must be lonely, though, living by yourself." He turned those penetrating green eyes on her, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but there are worse things than being alone. Being surrounded by people who make you feel alone, for instance. That is a special kind of hell." The words struck her like a physical blow, so accurate they seemed to have been pulled directly from her own thoughts. She looked away, blinking back sudden tears. "Yes," she whispered. "I suppose it is." Before Jacob could respond, Reverend Pritchard called everyone to gather for the blessing. Families clustered together, heads bowed, while the Reverend's voice rang out across the churchyard, thanking the Lord for the bounty of food and the blessing of community. Delilah kept her head down, feeling the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing. When the blessing ended, people surged toward the food tables in a somewhat organized chaos. Jacob stood and offered his hand to help her up. His palm was warm and rough against hers, and she felt a jolt of something electric pass between them when their skin touched. He did not release her immediately, and she found herself looking up at him, her hand still clasped in his much larger one. "Shall we get some food?" he asked, his voice lower than before, intimate somehow despite the crowd around them. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and he finally released her hand. They walked together to the tables, and Delilah felt a small surge of satisfaction when she noticed how the other women watched them with barely concealed envy and shock. Jacob Brennan was perhaps the most physically imposing man any of them had ever seen, and he had chosen to sit with her. She filled her plate with modest portions, suddenly self-conscious about eating in front of him. But when she glanced at his plate, piled high with chicken, biscuits, beans, and potato salad, she relaxed slightly. At least he would not judge her for having an appetite. They returned to the blanket and ate in companionable silence for several minutes. The food was good. The women of Cedar Falls might be judgmental and cruel, but they could certainly cook. Delilah found herself relaxing despite the continued stares and whispers. There was something solid and reassuring about Jacob's presence, as if his sheer size and strength created a buffer between her and the rest of the world. "So," he said eventually, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, "what is the story behind all the staring?" She nearly choked on her biscuit. "Excuse me, the women. They keep looking over here like you have grown a second head. Figure there must be a story to it." Delilah set down her plate, her appetite suddenly deserting her. "No real story. I am just not particularly well-liked." "Why not?" The blunt question surprised her. Most people danced around such topics, hiding behind polite euphemisms and careful phrasing. But Jacob Brennan apparently had no use for social niceties. "Because I am unmarried at 23, which makes me a spinster by their standards. Because my father just died and I am now alone in the world with no male relative to look after me. Because I am not built like the other women, and they seem to find that offensive somehow." The words came out more bitterly than she intended, and she immediately regretted her honesty. "I apologize. That was inappropriate." "Nothing inappropriate about speaking the truth." He took a long drink from his canteen before continuing. "People are cruel when they do not understand something. Easier to mock and exclude than to look at their own failings. You sound like you speak from experience." A shadow passed over his face there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Everyone has their demons, Miss Morrison. I am no exception." She wanted to ask what he meant, to peel back the layers of this mysterious man who had appeared in her life like something out of a dime novel. But before she could formulate a question that was not too forward, a group of children ran past their blanket, shrieking with laughter as they chased each other around the cottonwood trees. One of the boys, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, stumbled and fell directly onto their blanket, knocking over Jacob's plate and sending beans scattering across the gray wool. The child froze, his eyes going wide with fear as he looked up at Jacob's imposing figure. Delilah tensed, waiting for the explosion of anger, but Jacob simply reached down and helped the boy to his feet with surprising gentleness. "You all right, son?" The boy nodded mutely, still staring at Jacob with something approaching awe. "Good. Best be more careful where you are running. Do not want to hurt yourself." He brushed some dirt off the boy's shirt. "Go on now. Your friends are waiting." The child scampered off, and Jacob turned his attention to cleaning up the spilled food without complaint. Delilah found herself helping, gathering up the scattered beans and dabbing at the stains on the blanket with her napkin. "You are good with children," she observed. "Had younger siblings growing up. Learn to be patient." He wadded up the soiled napkin and set it aside. "You like children?" "Very much. I used to help teach Sunday school before." she trailed off, not wanting to finish the sentence. Before they decided you were not respectable enough. His perception was unnerving. Something like that. They finished cleaning up the mess, and Delilah became aware that the afternoon sun had shifted, casting dappled shadows across the blanket through the cottonwood leaves above. Around them, families were settling in for the lazy hours after the meal, the men discussing business and politics while the women watched over children and traded recipes. "Tell me about your father," Jacob said suddenly. "What kind of man was he?" The question caught her off guard, but she found herself wanting to answer. He was a good man. Strong, hardworking. He was the town blacksmith, had a reputation for fair dealing and quality work. After my mother died, he raised me on his own, taught me to be independent, to think for myself. I think that is part of why the other women do not care for me much. I do not always agree with how things are supposed to be done. Jacob nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Sounds like a good father. Must be hard losing him. "It is the loneliest I have ever felt," she admitted, surprised at her own candor. There was something about this man that made her want to speak truths she usually kept locked away. Everyone offers their condolences, but no one actually wants to help. They would rather gossip about what will become of me than offer real support. What will become of you? She had been asking herself that same question for 3 weeks. I am not sure. My father left me the house and a small amount of savings, but I need to find work. Problem is, no one in town wants to hire me. I have asked at the general store, the hotel, even the saloon, though that scandalized everyone even more. A woman alone is considered dangerous somehow, as if I might corrupt the entire town with my independence. That is foolish. That is Cedar Falls. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains visible in the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I might have a solution, if you are willing to consider it. Her heart began to pound, though she could not have said why. What kind of solution? I need someone to help me with my trapping operation. Been trying to do everything myself, setting traps, skinning pelts, smoking meat, tanning hides, but it is too much work for one person. If I had help, I could increase my productivity significantly. Could make enough to expand, maybe even hire on additional workers eventually. You are offering me a job. She tried to keep the disbelief out of her voice. I am offering you a proposition. Come work for me as my partner. I will teach you everything you need to know about trapping and surviving in the mountains. We split the profits 50-50. You will have your own cabin, separate from mine, so there will be no impropriety. And if you decide after a few months that it is not for you, you can take your earnings and go wherever you like. Delilah's mind raced. The offer was incredible, almost too good to be true, but it was also scandalous beyond measure. An unmarried woman, living alone in the mountains with a strange man. The gossip would be vicious. As if reading her thoughts, Jacob added, I know what it looks like, but Miss Morrison, you have already been judged and found wanting by these people. Question is, do you care more about their opinion or your own survival and happiness? It was the same question she had been asking herself for weeks, if not years. She looked around the churchyard, at the families who had excluded her, at the women who whispered behind their hands, at the men who looked through her as if she did not exist. What did she really have to lose? I would need time to think about it, she said carefully. This is not a decision to make lightly. Of course. I will be in town until tomorrow afternoon, staying at the boarding house on Main Street. If you decide you are interested, come find me before I leave. If not, I understand and I wish you well. The afternoon continued, but Delilah barely registered the conversations happening around them. Her mind churned with possibilities and fears, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. Jacob seemed content to sit in silence, occasionally making observations about the weather or the mountains, but never pressing her for an answer. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, families started packing up their belongings and loading wagons. Delilah helped Jacob fold the blanket, her fingers brushing against his more than once, each touch sending little sparks of awareness through her body. "Thank you," she said as they stood beside her father's wagon, "for sharing your blanket, for the conversation, for the offer. You did not have to do any of that. Maybe not, but seemed like the right thing to do." He settled the folded blanket under his arm and looked down at her with those intense green eyes. "Think about what I said, Miss Morrison. Sometimes the scariest path is the one that leads to freedom." He touched his forehead again in that same casual salute, then turned and walked away, his long strides carrying him quickly across the churchyard and out of sight. Delilah watched him go, her heart still racing, her mind already made up even though she would not admit it to herself, until she had spent a sleepless night weighing her options. She climbed into the wagon and guided the horse toward home, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her. Let them talk. They would talk regardless of what she did or did not do. At least if she accepted Jacob's offer, she would be far away where their words could not reach her. The house felt emptier than ever when she stepped inside, still smelling faintly of her father's tobacco and leather. She walked through the rooms, touching familiar objects, remembering moments from her childhood and young adulthood. This house held her entire history, every memory of her parents, every moment of joy and sorrow she had experienced. But it was also a prison, a constant reminder of what she had lost and what she would never have if she stayed in Cedar Falls. Delilah made herself a simple supper of bread and cheese, then sat at the kitchen table with paper and pencil, making lists of what she would need to take if she left, what she could sell, what she would have to leave behind. The practical planning helped calm her racing thoughts, gave her something concrete to focus on instead of the enormity of what she was considering. She slept poorly that night, her dreams filled with green eyes and mountain peaks, and the feeling of rough hands clasping hers with surprising gentleness. When dawn broke, she was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of strong coffee, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. By the time the town began to stir, she had made her decision. Delilah dressed carefully in a practical brown dress and sturdy boots, then pinned her hair back in a simple braid. She packed a small bag with essentials, locked up the house, and walked the 3 blocks to Main Street where the boarding house stood next to the general store. Mrs. Murphy, the boarding house owner, gave her a disapproving look when she asked for Jacob Brennan's room number. "Room 6, upstairs, though I do not think it is proper for a young lady to be visiting a gentleman in his room." "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Murphy." Delilah climbed the stairs before the woman could lecture her further. She knocked on the door to room 6, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the building could hear it. Footsteps approached, and then the door swung open to reveal Jacob, looking slightly rumpled from sleep, his dark hair hanging loose around his shoulders. "Miss Morrison," surprise flickered across his face. "I did not expect to see you so early. I have made my decision." She squared her shoulders, meeting his eyes directly. "If your offer still stands, I would like to accept it. I will come work with you as your partner." For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and she wondered if he was going to tell her he had changed his mind, that it had all been some kind of test or joke. But then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features into something almost beautiful. "The offer stands." "When can you be ready to leave?" "I need a few days to settle my father's affairs, sell the house and his tools, pack my belongings. Would a week from today work? A week is fine. I will come back to town on Sunday morning and meet you at your house. Bring warm clothes, sturdy boots, and anything else you think you might need. I can provide most of the equipment and supplies for trapping. They discussed logistics for several more minutes, standing in the doorway of his room while Mrs. Murphy watched from the bottom of the stairs with obvious disapproval. When they had settled the basic arrangements, Delilah turned to leave, but Jacob caught her hand gently. "Miss Morrison, Delilah, I want you to know what you are getting into. Life in the mountains is hard. The work is physically demanding, the winters are brutal, and you will be isolated from civilization for months at a time. If you have any doubts at all, now is the time to speak them." She looked down at his large hand engulfing hers, feeling the calluses and the strength, and then back up at his face. "I have no doubts, Mr. Brennan. I am stronger than I look, and I am not afraid of hard work. As for isolation, I have been isolated in a town full of people. At least in the mountains, I will be isolated with someone who does not judge me for existing." His grip tightened fractionally. "I think we are going to work well together, and please call me Jacob. We are going to be partners after all. Jacob then, and you should call me Delilah." He released her hand slowly, and she felt the loss of his warmth like a physical thing. "Until Sunday then, Delilah. Until Sunday." The next week passed in a blur of activity. Delilah met with her father's lawyer to transfer ownership of the house to a young couple who had recently married and needed a place to live. She sold his blacksmithing tools to his apprentice, who had worked with him for the past 3 years. She packed her mother's quilt, her father's pocket watch, her own clothes and personal belongings, and a few precious books into 2 large trunks. News of her impending departure spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire. The gossip reached new heights of scandal and speculation. She was running away with the mountain man. She had lost her mind with grief. She would be murdered in her sleep or worse. The women who had shunned her at the church picnic suddenly appeared on her doorstep with stern warnings and dire predictions. Delilah listened to them all with polite detachment, thanked them for their concern, and continued with her preparations. Their opinions had ceased to matter the moment she had knocked on Jacob's door. On Sunday morning, she woke before dawn and performed one final walk through the empty house, saying goodbye to her childhood and her parents' memory. She did not cry. There would be time for tears later if she needed them. Right now, she needed to be strong. Jacob arrived exactly when he said he would, driving a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 massive draft horses. He loaded her trunks with ease, muscles flexing beneath his shirt, and then helped her onto the wagon seat with a hand at her elbow. "Ready?" he asked, gathering the reins. She took one last look at Cedar Falls, at the church steeple rising above the other buildings, at the people beginning to emerge from their houses for Sunday services. "I am ready." The journey into the mountains took most of the day. The road, such as it was, quickly deteriorated into little more than a rough trail that wound between towering pines and massive granite outcroppings. The air grew thinner and cooler as they climbed, and Delilah found herself grateful for the shawl she had wrapped around her shoulders. Jacob handled the horses with practiced ease, navigating obstacles and rough terrain without apparent effort. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, a creek where he liked to fish, a meadow where elk gathered in the early morning. "How much farther?" she asked as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. "Another hour or so. We will make it before dark." True to his word, they arrived at his homestead just as twilight was painting the sky in shades of purple and indigo. Delilah's breath caught in her throat when she saw it. The main cabin was larger than she had expected, built from thick logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney rising from one end. A covered porch ran along the front, and she could see several chairs arranged there as if Jacob liked to sit and watch the sunset. Nearby stood a smaller cabin, newer looking, with a single window and its own small porch. "I built the second cabin last year," Jacob explained as he helped her down from the wagon. "Was thinking about taking on a partner eventually, so I wanted to have the space ready. That one is yours. It has a bed, a stove, storage for your belongings. We can add furniture as needed." Beyond the cabins, she could see various outbuildings, a barn for the horses, a smokehouse, what looked like a workshop, and several lean tos for storage. A small vegetable garden occupied a sunny spot near the main cabin, and a stream sparkled in the fading light about 50 yards away. It was beautiful and isolated, and unlike anything Delilah had ever experienced. "Let me show you around before it gets too dark," Jacob said, already unloading one of her trunks as if it weighed nothing. He gave her a thorough tour, pointing out where supplies were kept, how the water system worked, where the latrine was located. The smaller cabin was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in thick furs, a small wood stove, a table and chair, and hooks on the walls for hanging clothes. "I will bring your trunks in, and then I will make us some supper," Jacob said. "You must be exhausted from the journey." She was exhausted, but also exhilarated. This was her new home, her new life. No more judgmental stares, no more whispered gossip. Just the mountains and the sky and the work of survival. They ate together in the main cabin, which was more spacious and better furnished than hers. Jacob proved to be a competent cook, preparing venison stew with vegetables from his garden and fresh bread that he admitted he had baked that morning in preparation for her arrival. "Tomorrow, I will start teaching you the basics," he said as they ate. "How to set traps, identify animal tracks, prepare pelts. It will be overwhelming at first, but you will learn quickly. You have that look about you." "What look?" "Someone who does not give up easy, someone who is tougher than circumstances might suggest." She felt heat rise to her cheeks at the compliment. "I hope I can live up to your expectations. Something tells me you will exceed them." After supper, he walked her back to her cabin, carrying a lantern to light the way. The night had grown cold, and stars blazed overhead in numbers she had never seen from town. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. "It is beautiful," she breathed, staring upward. "Wait until winter." On clear nights, the northern lights sometimes dance across the sky in colors you would not believe. Green and purple and blue, moving like living curtains. The image he painted was so vivid she could almost see it. "I look forward to that." They reached her cabin and Jacob set the lantern on the porch. "If you need anything during the night, I am just across the way. Do not hesitate to wake me." "Thank you, Jacob, for everything." He looked down at her, his face half in shadow, half illuminated by the flickering lantern light. "Get some rest, Delilah. Tomorrow, your new life begins in earnest." She watched him walk back to his own cabin, his tall form eventually swallowed by darkness. Then she went inside, changed into her nightgown, and crawled beneath the furs on her narrow bed. The mattress was more comfortable than she had expected, and the furs were warm and soft. As she drifted toward sleep, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the forest at night, Delilah felt something she had not experienced in years: hope. The next morning began before dawn when Jacob knocked on her cabin door. "Time to start the day," he called. "Dress warm and meet me by the main cabin in 15 minutes." Delilah scrambled out of bed, her body protesting the early hour. She dressed quickly in practical clothing, a split skirt that would allow for easier movement, a thick shirt. Her sturdy boots and braided her hair back tightly. When she emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, she found Jacob waiting with 2 cups of steaming coffee. "First rule of mountain living," he said, handing her one of the cups. "Always start with coffee. You will need it." The coffee was strong and hot, burning a path down her throat and into her stomach. She sipped it gratefully as they walked toward the nearest tree line, Jacob carrying various implements and equipment. "We will start with the basics today," he explained. "I want to show you how to identify animal tracks, which species are worth trapping, and how to set a basic trap. Tomorrow, we will start checking my existing trap lines, and you can see the whole process from start to finish." The morning was a crash course in wilderness survival. Jacob taught her to distinguish between the tracks of marten, fox, beaver, and lynx. He showed her how to identify game trails and likely spots for setting traps. He demonstrated the proper way to set a steel trap, how to hide it effectively, and how to bait it for maximum success. Delilah absorbed everything like a sponge, asking questions when she did not understand, taking mental notes of every detail. The work was more physically demanding than she had anticipated, requiring them to hike several miles through rough terrain, often climbing over fallen logs or scrambling up steep slopes. But she refused to complain or ask for rest, determined to prove she could handle whatever the mountains threw at her. Jacob watched her carefully throughout the day, she noticed, as if assessing her capabilities. But he did not coddle her or suggest they slow down. Instead, he treated her like an equal partner, expecting her to keep up and contribute. By the time they returned to the cabins for a midday meal, Delilah's legs were shaking with exhaustion, and her lungs burned from the thin mountain air. But she had never felt more alive. "You did well," Jacob said as they ate cold venison and bread on his porch. "Better than I expected for your first day. My legs may disagree with you tomorrow." He chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that did pleasant things to her insides. "They will adjust. Give it a week, and you will be able to hike all day without getting winded." After their meal, he took her to his workshop and showed her how to prepare pelts for sail scraping, stretching, drying. The process was messy and required significant upper body strength, but Jacob was patient in his instruction, demonstrating the techniques multiple times until she felt confident attempting them herself. Days turned into weeks, and Delilah fell into the rhythm of mountain life. Each morning began before dawn with coffee and preparation for the day's work. They would hike the trap lines together, checking each trap, resetting those that had been sprung, and harvesting any animals they had caught. Afternoons were spent processing pelts, smoking meat, maintaining equipment, and completing the countless other tasks required for survival. The work was hard, harder than anything she had done in her previous life. Her hands developed calluses, her arms grew stronger, her endurance increased. She learned to move quietly through the forest, to raid the land, to anticipate the weather by watching the sky and feeling the wind. But more than the physical skills, she learned about Jacob. He was a man of few words, preferring to communicate through action rather than conversation. But when he did speak, his words carried weight. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard, making her laugh when she least expected it. He was patient with her mistakes, encouraging when she succeeded, and protective in a way that never felt condescending. She learned that he had grown up in Montana, the eldest of 6 children, and had left home at 18 to make his own way in the world. He had worked as a ranch hand, a prospector, and a scout for wagon trains before finally settling in these mountains 5 years ago. He never spoke of why he preferred isolation, and she did not ask, respecting his privacy the way he respected hers. As September gave way to October, the aspens turned gold and the nights grew colder. Jacob began teaching her how to prepare for winter cutting and stacking firewood, smoking and preserving meat, checking the cabins for drafts and making repairs. They fell into an easy partnership, anticipating each other's needs, working together with increasing efficiency. But beneath the comfortable routine, Delilah felt something else growing, something warm and complicated that made her heart race when Jacob stood too close or their hands brushed while working. She told herself it was simply gratitude, appreciation for the opportunity he had given her. But late at night, lying alone in her cabin, she could not deny the truth. She was falling in love with Jacob Brennan. The realization terrified her. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, a partnership based on mutual benefit. Romantic feelings would only complicate things, especially if they were not reciprocated. She had no way of knowing if Jacob felt anything beyond friendly regard for her, but she caught him watching her sometimes, his green eyes intense and unreadable. And there were moments when his hand would linger on her arm or back, contact that lasted just slightly longer than necessary. Small gestures that might mean everything or nothing at all. One evening in late October, they were sitting on Jacob's porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of orange and crimson. The air had a sharp bite to it, promising the first snow of the season. "Winter will be here soon," Jacob said, his voice thoughtful. "Once the heavy snows start, we will be isolated up here for months. No way to get down to town even if we wanted to. Are you prepared for that?" "I think so. We have plenty of supplies, the cabins are weatherproof, and I am getting better at snowshoeing." "That is not what I meant." He turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I meant mentally, emotionally. Being cut off from the rest of the world for months at a time with only one other person for company, it can be challenging. People can get cabin fever, start feeling trapped." "I do not think I will feel trapped," she said honestly. "These past few weeks have been the freest I have ever felt in my life." Something flickered in his eyes there and gone too quickly for her to identify. "Good. That is good." They sat in silence for a while longer, and Delilah gathered her courage. "Jacob, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. Cannot promise I will answer, but you can ask." "Why did you really invite me to come here? I have been wondering about it." "You could have asked anyone in town to be your partner, someone with more experience in outdoor work. Why choose me?" He was quiet for so long she thought he was not going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Because when I looked at you that day at the church picnic, I saw someone who understood what it was like to be alone in a crowd. Someone who had been judged and found wanting for reasons that had nothing to do with her actual worth as a person. And I thought, here is a woman who deserves better than what life has handed her. If I could give her a chance at something different, maybe something better, why would I not do that?" Delilah's throat tightened with emotion. "That is possibly the kindest thing anyone has ever said to me." "I am not known for my kindness," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "But I call things as I see them. And I saw someone worth saving, even if you did not need saving so much as an opportunity to save yourself." She reached over and placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." He covered her hand with his own, and they sat that way as darkness fell around them, neither one wanting to break the moment. When Delilah finally stood to return to her cabin, Jacob walked her across the clearing as he did every night, carrying a lantern to light her way. At her door he paused. "Delilah, I need you to know something. You have become important to me, not just as a partner, but as a person. I value your company, your conversation, your presence here. If winter becomes too hard, if you decide this life is not what you want, I will understand. But I hope you will stay." Her heart soared. It was not a declaration of love, but it was something. An acknowledgement that she mattered to him beyond her usefulness as a worker. "I am not going anywhere," she said softly. "This is my home now. You are my home now." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Jacob's hand came up to cup her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her skin. For a moment, she thought he was going to kiss her. But instead, he simply brushed his thumb across her cheekbone in a gesture of infinite tenderness. "Sleep well, Delilah. Good night, Jacob." The first snow came 3 days later, arriving in the night and transforming the world into a wonderland of white. Delilah woke to find everything covered in a thick blanket of pristine snow, the silence almost overwhelming after months of forest sounds. Winter had arrived, and with it came a new phase of their life together. The snow brought changes to their routine. Checking trap lines now required snowshoes and took twice as long. Game became scarcer, and they had to rely more heavily on their preserved supplies. The cold was intense, requiring constant fires and multiple layers of clothing even inside the cabins, but it also brought a strange kind of intimacy. With the outside world completely inaccessible, they were truly alone together, dependent on each other for company and survival. They began spending more time in the evenings together, playing cards or chess by firelight, reading aloud from the books she had brought, sharing stories from their pasts. Jacob spoke more during those long winter nights than he had in all the previous months combined. She learned about his childhood in Montana, about the younger siblings he had helped raise, about his brief engagement to a woman who had ultimately chosen security over adventure. "She wanted me to settle down, take a job in town, live a conventional life," he explained one evening as they sat by his fireplace, the wind howling outside. "But I could not do it. The thought of being trapped in one place, answering to a boss, living by society's rules, it made me feel like I was suffocating. So I ended it and came here instead." "Do you ever regret it?" Delilah asked. "Not for a second." "Well, maybe some seconds during the worst parts of winter when I am chopping firewood in a blizzard. But overall, no, this life suits me." He looked at her, firelight casting shadows across his bearded face. "What about you? Any regrets about leaving Cedar Falls? Only that I did not do it sooner." He smiled, and they lapsed into comfortable silence, listening to the fire crackle and pop. These evenings had become Delilah's favorite part of the day. The work finished, bellies full, nothing to do but enjoy each other's company and the warmth of the fire. But the attraction between them was becoming harder to ignore. She caught Jacob staring at her more frequently, his eyes dark with something that looked like hunger. And she knew he could sense her awareness of him, the way her breathing would quicken when he stood close, how her skin would flush when their hands touched. The tension built slowly, like snow accumulating on a mountain slope, waiting for something to trigger an avalanche. The trigger came in December, during a particularly brutal storm that lasted 3 days. The snow fell so heavily they could barely see from one cabin to the other, and the wind threatened to tear the roofs off the buildings. On the second night of the storm, Delilah woke to the sound of something crashing outside her cabin. She scrambled out of bed, pulling on her robe, and opened the door to find that a large tree branch had fallen across her porch, smashing through the railing and blocking her door. She was trying to figure out how to move it when Jacob appeared, fighting his way through the blizzard with a lantern held high. "Are you all right?" he shouted over the wind. "I am fine, but I cannot get out. The branch is too heavy." He examined the situation quickly. "The branch also damaged your chimney. You cannot stay here tonight. The cabin will fill with smoke if you try to keep the fire going. Come on, you will stay in my cabin until the storm passes and I can make repairs." Delilah wanted to argue, aware of how inappropriate it would be for her to spend the night in his cabin. But the wind was brutal, the snow was blinding, and her cabin was already growing cold without the fire. She quickly grabbed a few essentials and followed Jacob back to his cabin, clutching his arm to keep from being blown off her feet. Inside, the temperature difference was immediate and wonderful. Jacob's fire was roaring, casting warmth and light throughout the space. He helped her out of her snow-covered robe and boots, then guided her to a chair near the fire. "Sit. Warm up. I will make some hot tea." She sat, shivering as much from adrenaline as from cold, while Jacob moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency. He brought her a thick quilt to wrap around her shoulders, then prepared tea with honey and handed her the steaming mug. "Thank you," she said, her teeth still chattering slightly. "I am sorry to impose on you like this." "You are not imposing. I am just glad you are safe." He settled into the chair across from her, his expression troubled. "That branch could have fallen through your roof instead of just hitting your porch, could have killed you. But it did not. I am fine. This time." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Delilah, I have been thinking. Your cabin is smaller and not as well built as mine. When the weather gets really bad, it is not as safe. Maybe you should just move your things in here permanently. I can sleep in the loft, you can have the main room. We would still have privacy, but you would be safer." Her heart began to race. "Jacob, we cannot. People in town already assume the worst about us. If anyone ever found out we were living in the same cabin, who cares what they think?" he interrupted, his voice passionate. "They judged you unfairly from the start. Nothing you do will ever be good enough for them. Why should their opinions dictate how you live your life? Because even though I left, even though I am building a new life here, some part of me still cares about my reputation, about being seen as respectable." He leaned forward, his green eyes intense. "Delilah, you are the most respectable person I have ever known. You work hard, you are honest, you keep your word. That is real respectability, not the false morality of people who judge others while hiding their own sins. Who cares if we share a cabin if we are both living honorably?" She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe that it was that simple, but years of social conditioning could not be overcome so easily. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "For tonight, I am grateful for your hospitality and your concern. But this is a big decision, and I need to consider it carefully." He nodded, though she could see disappointment flicker across his face. "Of course. Take all the time you need." They sat in awkward silence for a while, the easy companionship of earlier evenings replaced by tension and unspoken feelings. Eventually, Jacob stood and began preparing the loft for sleeping, climbing the ladder to arrange furs and blankets into a makeshift bed. "You take the main bed," he said when he came back down. "I will be comfortable up there." "Jacob, I cannot take your bed." "Yes, you can. It is not up for debate." His tone brooked no argument. "Now get some sleep. The storm should pass by morning, and I will start on repairs as soon as it is safe to go outside." Delilah gave in, too exhausted to argue further. She changed into her nightgown behind a privacy screen Jacob had set up for her, then climbed into his bed. The mattress was larger and more comfortable than hers, and the furs smelled of hemp pine and wood smoke, and that indefinable masculine scent that made her heart race. She lay awake for a long time, listening to Jacob moving around in the loft above her, acutely aware of his presence just a few feet away. When his movements finally stilled and his breathing evened out into the rhythm of sleep, she allowed herself to relax, but sleep did not come easily. She was too aware of the intimacy of the situation, of how domestic and right it felt to be sleeping under the same roof as Jacob. And that awareness brought with it a longing so intense it was almost painful. She was in love with him. Completely, hopelessly in love. And lying here in his bed, surrounded by his scent and his belongings, she could no longer pretend otherwise. The storm passed by morning, just as Jacob had predicted. Delilah woke to bright sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of coffee and bacon. She sat up to find Jacob already dressed and cooking breakfast, moving around the cabin with quiet efficiency so as not to wake her. "Good morning," he said when he noticed her stirring. "I let you sleep in. You looked like you needed the rest. What time is it?" "About 9. The storm cleared around dawn. I already checked your cabin. The damage is not as bad as I thought. I can have it repaired by this afternoon if I start now." They ate breakfast together, the awkwardness from the previous night dissipating in the bright morning light. Afterward, Jacob went to work on her cabin while Delilah cleaned up and tended to various indoor tasks. True to his word, he had her cabin repaired and habitable again by late afternoon. But something had shifted between them. They were more careful around each other now, more aware, as if the enforced intimacy of the night before had stripped away some protective layer they had both been maintaining. Delilah found herself thinking constantly about Jacob's proposal that she move into his cabin permanently. The practical arguments for it were sound. Her cabin was smaller and more vulnerable to the elements. But the emotional implications were enormous. Sharing a living space would inevitably lead to greater intimacy, to questions about the nature of their relationship. And what was the nature of their relationship? They were business partners, certainly. Friends, definitely. But was there something more? Did Jacob feel the same attraction she did? Or was she reading too much into small gestures and kind words? Christmas approached, and Delilah decided to do something special. She had brought flour and sugar and spices with her from Cedar Falls, carefully hoarded for special occasions. Now she used them to bake cookies and a simple cake, working in secret in her cabin while Jacob was out checking trap lines. On Christmas morning, she woke early and carried her baked goods to his cabin. Along with a present she had made for him, a new shirt sewn from fabric she had brought with her, sized to fit his broad shoulders and long arms. She found him already awake, sitting by the fire with his coffee, looking somehow lonely despite the warmth and comfort of the cabin. His face lit up when she entered with her offerings. "Merry Christmas," she said, suddenly shy. "I know it is not much, but I wanted to do something special." "Delilah." He stood, staring at the cookies and cake as if they were precious jewels. "You did not have to do this. I wanted to. You have given me so much: a home, a purpose, companionship. This is a small way of saying thank you." He took the plate of cookies from her hands and set it on the table, then pulled her into a hug that took her breath away. His arms wrapped around her, strong and warm, and she felt him bury his face in her hair. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have not celebrated Christmas in years. Did not see the point when I was alone, but this is the best gift anyone has ever given me." She hugged him back, her arms barely able to reach around his broad chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. They stood that way for a long moment, holding each other in the golden morning light, neither one wanting to let go. When they finally separated, Jacob cleared his throat and turned away, busying himself with pouring coffee. "I have something for you too," he said, his back still to her. "I am not as good at this kind of thing as you are, but I tried." He handed her a small package wrapped in soft leather. Inside, she found a beautiful knife with an intricately carved bone handle and a perfectly balanced blade. "I made it myself," he explained, watching her nervously. "Thought you should have your own knife, properly sized for your hand. A good knife is essential out here, and the one you have been using was too big for you." The gift was practical and thoughtful, clearly requiring hours of skilled work. Delilah ran her fingers over the carved handle, touched beyond words. "Jacob, this is beautiful. I will treasure it always. There is something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Open it." Inside the pouch was a delicate necklace made from carved wood, each bead a tiny perfect pine cone strung on a leather cord. The workmanship was exquisite, each detail rendered with obvious care. "I carved them during the evenings," he said, sounding almost embarrassed. "I know it is not fancy like jewelry from a store, but I wanted you to have something pretty, something that reminded you of the mountains and your time here." Tears stung her eyes. No one had ever made her something so beautiful, so personal. "Will you help me put it on?" He took the necklace with slightly shaking hands and moved behind her, lifting the cord over her head and fastening it at the nape of her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin, sending shivers down her spine. When he finished, his hands lingered on her shoulders. "Delilah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "there is something I need to tell you." She turned to face him, her heart pounding. "What is it?" He looked down at her, his green eyes blazing with intensity. "These past few months, having you here, working with you, talking with you, spending time with you, it has changed me. You have changed me. I came to the mountains to be alone because I thought that was what I wanted. But now I cannot imagine being here without you. You have become essential to me, Delilah, not just as a partner but as something more. Jacob." She reached up to touch his bearded face, her hand trembling. "I feel the same way. I have for weeks now. I tried to tell myself it was just gratitude or loneliness, but I cannot lie to myself anymore. I love you." The words hung between them for a breathless moment. Then Jacob was kissing her, his lips claiming hers with a passion that took her breath away. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest as if he wanted to absorb her into himself. Delilah kissed him back with everything she had, pouring months of longing and desire into the embrace. His beard was softer than she had imagined, his lips surprisingly gentle despite the intensity of his passion. She threaded her fingers through his long hair, holding him close, never wanting to let go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. Marry me, Delilah. Be my wife, my partner in all things. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." Joy exploded in her chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her again, softer this time, almost reverent. When he pulled back, he was smiling, and she realized it was the first time she had seen him truly, completely happy. "We will have to wait until spring to make it official," he said, stroking her hair back from her face. "Cannot get down to town to find a preacher until the snow melts. But as far as I am concerned, you are already mine, and I am already yours. I do not need a preacher to know we belong together," she said. "God knows what is in our hearts. The ceremony is just formality." They spent the rest of Christmas Day together, talking and planning their future. Jacob wanted to expand his operation, maybe build a larger cabin that could accommodate a family someday. Delilah wanted to start a proper garden in the spring, maybe even get some chickens and a milk cow. They dreamed together, building castles in the air that felt more solid and real than anything Delilah had experienced in Cedar Falls. That night, she moved her belongings into Jacob's cabin, no longer caring about propriety or reputation. They were committed to each other, and that was all that mattered. Jacob created a private space for her in one corner, hanging blankets to give her somewhere to change and dress, maintaining their separate sleeping arrangements even though they were now under the same roof. But as winter deepened, and they grew more comfortable with their new status as an engaged couple, the physical distance became harder to maintain. They began sitting closer together in the evenings, holding hands while they talked, stealing kisses that grew longer and more passionate. One night in January, after a particularly tender kiss goodnight, Jacob caught her hand as she moved toward her sleeping area. "Stay with me," he said, his voice rough with desire. "I know we should wait until the wedding, but Delilah, I do not think I can wait any more. I want you. I want to truly make you mine." She should have been scandalized. A proper woman would have insisted they wait for the official ceremony. But Delilah was discovering she had little use for propriety when it conflicted with what her heart wanted. "I want that too," she admitted. "I want to be yours in every way." He led her to his bed, their bed now, and they came together with a passion and tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. Jacob was gentle with her, taking his time, making sure she felt cherished and loved. Afterward, they lay tangled together beneath the furs, her head resting on his chest, his arms wrapped securely around her. "I love you," he murmured into her hair. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "I love you too," she whispered back, feeling more content and safe than she had ever felt in her life. Winter continued its hold on the mountains, but inside their cabin it was always warm. They fell into a new routine, one that included shared meals and shared sleeping arrangements, stolen kisses while working, and long nights of passion and intimacy. Jacob was an attentive and generous lover, always putting her pleasure before his own, learning what she liked and needed. Delilah discovered a sensual side of herself she had not known existed, finding confidence in how Jacob desired her curves, how his hands worshipped her body, how he whispered that she was beautiful and perfect exactly as she was. "You are magnificent," he told her one night, his hands tracing the curves of her hips and waist. "Every inch of you. I never understood how the people in that town could not see it. They were looking for someone different," she said, trailing her fingers down his muscled chest. "Someone smaller, more delicate, more conventional. Then they are fools. You are strong enough to survive in these mountains, brave enough to start a completely new life, resilient enough to handle whatever challenges come your way. That is what real beauty looks like." His words healed something in her she had not realized was broken. For so long, she had internalized the judgment of Cedar Falls, had believed on some level that there was something wrong with her. But Jacob saw her clearly, loved her completely, and in his eyes, she was finally able to see herself as worthy. February brought more storms, but they barely noticed, content in their warm cabin with each other for company. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing hopes and fears and dreams. Jacob spoke of his childhood more openly now, admitting that part of why he had left Montana was to escape the expectations of his family, who had wanted him to take over the family ranch. "I love my family," he explained one evening as they lay in bed, watching shadows dance on the ceiling. "But I needed to forge my own path, prove I could survive and thrive on my own terms. Coming here, building this life, it was about more than just escaping civilization. It was about finding out who I was when I was stripped down to basics." "And who are you?" she asked, turning in his arms to face him. "I am a man who values freedom above security, who finds peace in solitude but joy in the right company. I am someone who needed to test himself against the wilderness to understand his own strength. And I am a man who fell in love with a woman brave enough to do the same thing. I did not feel brave when I made the decision to come here," she admitted. "I felt desperate and scared and like I had nothing to lose. Bravery and desperation often look the same at the outset. It is only looking back that you can tell the difference. And Delilah, you were brave. You are brave. Never doubt that." March arrived with the first hints of spring longer days, warmer temperatures, the sound of snow melting and water running. They began preparing for the trip down to town, planning to get married officially and stock up on supplies they would need for the summer season. "Are you ready to face Cedar Falls again?" Jacob asked one evening as they organized their pelts for sale. "I am ready to face anything as long as you are with me," she said honestly. "Besides, I am not the same woman who left 6 months ago. I am stronger now, more confident. They do not have power over me anymore. That is my girl." He pulled her into his arms, kissing the top of her head. "We will go in, conduct our business, get married, and leave. We do not owe them explanations or justifications for how we live our lives." The trip to Cedar Falls took 2 days, as the roads were muddy and difficult to navigate with the spring thaw. When they finally reached town, Delilah felt oddly disconnected from the place that had once been her entire world. It seemed smaller somehow, less significant. News of their arrival spread quickly, and by the time they reached the general store to sell their pelts, a small crowd had gathered. The store owner, Mr. Peterson, examined their offerings with a critical eye before grudgingly admitting they were some of the finest quality pelts he had seen in years. "You did well for yourself, Miss Morrison," he said, counting out their payment. "Looks like Mountain Life agrees with you. It is Mrs. Brennan now, actually," Jacob interjected, his arm settling protectively around Delilah's waist. "Or it will be by this evening. We are here to get married officially." The announcement caused a ripple of shocked whispers through the gathered crowd. Mrs. Henderson, who had been one of Delilah's harshest critics at the church picnic, pushed forward. "You are actually marrying her?" she asked Jacob, as if Delilah was not standing right there. "But surely you could do better. There are plenty of nice young women in town who would make suitable wives." Jacob's expression hardened into something dangerous. "Ma'am, I suggest you watch your tongue. Delilah is the finest woman I have ever met, and I am lucky she agreed to marry me. Anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." The menace in his voice was unmistakable. Mrs. Henderson took a step back, her face flushing with embarrassment and anger. But she said nothing more. They found Reverend Pritchard at the church, preparing for evening services. He agreed to perform the ceremony that afternoon, though his expression suggested he had reservations about the match. They returned to the boarding house to clean up and change into their best clothes. Delilah wore a simple blue dress, the nicest one she owned, and fixed her hair in an elegant bun at the nape of her neck. When she emerged from her room, Jacob was waiting for her in the hallway, dressed in clean trousers and a new shirt. His hair was still damp from washing, and he had trimmed his beard. "You look beautiful," he said, offering his arm. "You look rather handsome yourself." They walked to the church together, and Delilah was surprised to find several people gathered there, not friends, exactly, but curious townspeople who wanted to witness the wedding. Among them, she was touched to see Thomas, her father's former apprentice, and his wife Mary. The ceremony was brief and perfunctory. Reverend Pritchard read the traditional vows, and Jacob and Delilah repeated them, their voices steady and sure. When it came time to exchange rings, Jacob produced 2 simple gold bands he had purchased from the general store that morning. He slid one onto her finger, and she did the same for him, their eyes locked together, the rest of the world fading away. In that moment, nothing existed except the 2 of them and the promises they were making. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Pritchard said. "You may kiss your bride." Jacob cupped Delilah's face in his large hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart swell. When they broke apart, she saw tears shining in his green eyes. "I love you, Mrs. Brennan," he whispered. "I love you too, Mr. Brennan." They signed the marriage certificate, accepted awkward congratulations from the few townspeople who approached them, and then escaped back to the boarding house. They celebrated their wedding night in the small room Jacob had rented, making love slowly and sweetly, cementing their commitment to each other. The next morning, they loaded their wagon with supplies and began the journey back to the mountains. As Cedar Falls disappeared behind them, Delilah felt no sadness, only relief and joy. She was going home with her husband, to the life they were building together. Spring in the mountains was a revelation. Wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion, painting the meadows in every color imaginable. The streams ran high and clear with snowmelt. Baby animals appeared, deer fawns, fox kits, bear cubs. The world felt fresh and new and full of possibility. Delilah threw herself into creating a proper home. She planted a large garden with vegetables and herbs, built a chicken coop, and purchased 6 laying hens from a homesteader they met on one of their supply runs. She sewed curtains for the windows, made braided rugs for the floor, and organized their living space with a woman's touch. Jacob watched her domestic efforts with obvious pleasure, frequently stopping his work to come up behind her and wrap his arms around her waist, nuzzling her neck and making her laugh. "I like having a wife," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Like coming home to find you here, seeing what you have done with the place. Feels complete now, in a way it never did before." "I like being your wife," she responded, leaning back against his chest. "I never knew I could be this happy." Summer brought long days of work and short nights of passion. They expanded their trapping operation, setting up new lines in areas Jacob had been eyeing for years, but never had time to develop alone. With Delilah as his partner, they could cover more ground and harvest more pelts. But they also made time for pleasure. Jacob taught her to fish in the mountain streams, showed her the best places to find wild berries and mushrooms. They took long hikes on their days off, exploring the wilderness together, making love in hidden meadows beneath the vast blue sky. In August, exactly 1 year after the church picnic that had changed both their lives, Delilah realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another week to be certain before telling Jacob, wanting to be absolutely sure. When she finally shared the news, they were eating supper on the porch, enjoying the cool evening air after a hot day. "Jacob, I have something to tell you." He looked up from his plate, immediately attentive to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. Everything is perfect, actually. I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then a slow smile spread across his face, transforming into a grin that lit up his entire face. He stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair, pulled her to her feet, and spun her around in a circle. "We are having a baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Delilah, we are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" she asked, though his reaction made the answer obvious. "Happy. I am beyond happy. I am ecstatic." He set her down carefully, then immediately dropped to his knees and pressed his ear against her still flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. This is your father. I cannot wait to meet you." Delilah laughed, running her fingers through his hair. "I do not think the baby can hear you yet. Probably not, but I wanted to introduce myself early." He looked up at her, his eyes shining with tears. "Thank you, Delilah, for everything. For taking a chance on me, for building this life with me, for giving me a family. You have given me everything I never knew I wanted." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Delilah felt well throughout, with only minor morning sickness in the first few months. As her belly grew, Jacob became increasingly protective, insisting she rest more and let him handle the heavier tasks. "I am pregnant, not an invalid," she protested when he tried to carry a basket of laundry for her. "I know. But indulge me. I want to take care of you and our child." She could not argue with that, so she let him fuss over her, secretly enjoying his attentiveness. He was constantly bringing her things, wildflowers he had picked, a particularly beautiful stone he had found, extra portions of food to make sure she and the baby were well nourished. As winter approached again, they made preparations not just for the season but for the baby's arrival. Jacob built a cradle from pine wood, carving intricate designs into the headboard. Delilah sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her hands creating the first garments their child would wear. The baby was due in late March or early April, which meant they would be isolated in the mountains when it came time for the birth. Delilah tried not to be afraid, but as the date approached, her anxiety grew. What if something goes wrong? She asked Jacob one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her swollen belly. "What if there are complications? We are so far from any doctor or midwife." "Then we will handle it together," he said firmly. "You are strong, Delilah, stronger than any woman I have ever known. And I will be right here with you every step of the way. We will get through this like we have gotten through everything else together." His confidence bolstered her courage. He was right. They had survived so much already. They would survive this too. The baby came in early April, during a spring snowstorm that left them completely isolated. The labor was long and difficult, testing Delilah's strength and endurance to the limit. Jacob stayed with her throughout, holding her hand, wiping her forehead with cool cloths, encouraging her when she thought she could not go on. "You can do this," he said as another contraction racked her body. "You are the bravest woman I know. Just a little longer, my love." Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that seemed to shake the very rafters of the cabin. Jacob caught him with hands that were surprisingly steady, cutting the cord and wrapping him in a soft blanket before placing him in Delilah's arms. She looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and perfect, and felt her heart expand to accommodate a love so vast it was almost frightening in its intensity. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Jacob sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around her shoulders, staring at their son with an expression of absolute wonder. "He is perfect. You did so well, Delilah. I am so proud of you." "What should we name him?" she asked, tracing her finger over the baby's tiny hand. "What about Benjamin after your father, and James for his middle name after mine? Benjamin James Brennan." She tested the name, finding it fit perfectly. Yes, that is his name. The first few weeks with a newborn were exhausting but joyful. Benjamin was a good baby, healthy and strong, with his father's green eyes and his mother's auburn hair. Jacob proved to be a devoted father, taking over many of the household tasks, so Delilah could rest and recover, walking the floor with Benjamin when he cried, staring at him for hours as if he could not quite believe this miraculous creature existed. "I never knew I could love someone so much so quickly," Jacob said one evening, cradling Benjamin in his massive arms while the baby slept. Looking at him, I would do anything to protect him, to give him a good life. "He is lucky to have you as his father," Delilah said, watching them together with a full heart. As spring turned to summer, they settled into a new normal. Benjamin grew and thrived, his personality beginning to emerge. He was a happy baby, quick to smile, fascinated by the world around him. They took him on walks through the forest, showed him the garden and the animals, talked to him constantly, though he was too young to understand. Life fell into a comfortable rhythm. They worked their trap lines, tended the garden, cared for Benjamin, and found time to reconnect as a couple. Their love deepened rather than diminished with the addition of their son, as they discovered new facets of each other in their roles as parents. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Benjamin took his first steps, spoke his first words, grew from baby to toddler to young boy. 2 years after his birth, they welcomed a daughter, Sarah, who had her mother's curves and her father's confident nature. 3 years after that came another son, Thomas, named for the apprentice who had been one of the few kind faces at their wedding. The cabin expanded to accommodate their growing family. Jacob built additional rooms, turning their simple dwelling into a proper home. The garden grew larger each year, providing fresh vegetables throughout the summer. They acquired a milk cow, more chickens, even a few pigs. Their trapping operation became increasingly successful, gaining a reputation for quality pelts that commanded premium prices. Other trappers sought Jacob's advice, and he began mentoring young men who wanted to learn the trade. Their isolated homestead became less isolated as word spread of the successful couple living in the mountains, but they never lost sight of what was important. Family came first, always. Jacob made sure to spend time with each child individually, teaching Benjamin and Thomas to trap and hunt, teaching Sarah to identify plants and track animals. Delilah homeschooled all 3 children, using the books she had brought from Cedar Falls and others they acquired on their supply runs. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Jacob surprised her with a trip just the 2 of them to a hot springs he had discovered years earlier, but never shown her. They left the children with a neighboring family for 2 days and rode into the mountains together. The hot springs were everything Jacob had promised: a series of natural pools heated by geothermal activity, surrounded by towering pines and granite cliffs. They spent 2 days swimming, talking, making love beneath the stars, reconnecting as husband and wife rather than just as parents. "Do you ever regret it?" Jacob asked as they soaked in one of the pools, watching the stars come out overhead. "Leaving Cedar Falls, choosing this hard life in the mountains." "Not for a single moment," Delilah answered honestly. "This life, this family, it is everything I never knew I wanted. Those people at the church picnic thought they were punishing me by excluding me, by judging me. But their cruelty gave me the push I needed to change my life. In a way, I should thank them." "I am the one who should be thanking them," Jacob said, pulling her closer. "If they had accepted you, if they had been kind, you never would have been sitting alone under that tree. I never would have had the courage to approach you. We never would have built this life together. Then I suppose some good came from their judgment after all." She kissed him softly. "Though I prefer to think that we would have found each other somehow, no matter what. Some people are just meant to be together. Like us. Like us." More years passed. Benjamin grew into a young man, tall and strong like his father, with his mother's kind heart. He eventually married a girl from a neighboring homestead and built his own cabin a few miles away, continuing the family trapping business. Sarah became a teacher, establishing a small school for the children of families living in the mountains. Thomas developed a talent for carpentry, crafting beautiful furniture that became sought after in towns throughout Colorado. Jacob and Delilah watched their children grow and thrive with deep satisfaction. They had given them roots and wings, a strong foundation of love and security, and the freedom to choose their own paths. And through it all, their love for each other only deepened. As they entered their later years, they spent more time sitting on their porch, watching the sunset over the mountains, holding hands and remembering their life together. The work was easier now, with their children and grandchildren helping with the heavy labor. But they still walked the forest together, still found quiet moments of intimacy, still looked at each other with the same love and desire that had drawn them together all those years ago. "You remember the church picnic?" Delilah asked one evening, her hair now streaked with silver, her body softer and rounder with age. "Every detail," Jacob said, his own hair and beard now completely gray. "I remember seeing you standing by that wagon, looking lost and alone. I remember thinking I had never seen anyone so beautiful and so sad at the same time. And I remember deciding in that moment that I was going to speak to you, even though I normally avoided social interactions like the plague. Best decision you ever made. Second best. The best decision I ever made was asking you to marry me." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "You gave me everything, Delilah. A home, a family, a purpose. Before you, I was just surviving. You taught me how to truly live." "We taught each other," she corrected. "You showed me I was worthy of love exactly as I was. You gave me confidence and purpose and a life beyond my wildest dreams. We saved each other." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the mountains in shades of fire. In the distance, they could see smoke rising from Benjamin's chimney, could hear the faint sound of Sarah's children playing in the meadow. This was their legacy, not just the children and grandchildren who bore their names, but the love that had created them. A love that had started with a simple act of kindness at a church picnic, when a mountain man had shared his blanket with a shunned woman, and in doing so had changed both their lives forever. "Thank you," Delilah said softly, leaning her head on Jacob's shoulder. "For what?" "For seeing me when no one else would, for sharing your blanket that day, for giving me a chance at happiness." He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "I am the one who should be thanking you. You took a chance on a lonely mountain man and turned him into the luckiest man alive." As twilight deepened into night and stars began to appear overhead, they remained on the porch, wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for the long and beautiful journey they had shared. The church ladies who had judged Delilah all those years ago would never understand the gift their cruelty had given. In trying to diminish her, they had inadvertently set her on the path to her true home, her true purpose, her true love. And that, Delilah thought as she drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, was the greatest revenge of all, not bitterness or anger, but a life so full of love and joy that their judgment became meaningless. She had found her place in the world, not in spite of being different, but because of it. She had found someone who loved her not despite her curves and independence, but because of them. Years later, when Delilah passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 81, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, Jacob held her hand and told her one last time how much he loved her. He followed her 6 months later, and they were buried together on a hill overlooking their homestead, beneath 2 pine trees that had grown intertwined, their branches forever joined. Their story became legend in the mountains, the tale of the curvy woman who had been shunned at a church picnic, and the mountain man who had shared his blanket with her, and how that simple act of kindness had blossomed into a love that lasted a lifetime and beyond. Families would tell the story to their children on cold winter nights, reminding them that kindness matters, that true love exists, and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. The homestead remained in the family for generations, expanded and improved but never abandoned. And on quiet evenings, people swore they could still see 2 figures sitting on the porch, watching the sunset hand in hand, their love eternal as the mountains themselves. The end.